I have myself dabbled in the art of biography, and in these dabblings I think I've gained some insights into the extremely tricky nature of the genre. This was my very first effort at undertaking a biography. It was done as a commission for the new Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. And you can see here my entry on the practitioner Edwin Lee, who died in 1870 and had something of a troubled relationship with his own profession. You'll note that I have a very strong conclusion at the end about his significance and where he stood in the scheme of things, very hard and fast. If you read through the piece as well, you'll also see that it's immersed in social history. Now, I think that it's quite interesting to compare that with the original entry that was published in 1892. If you compare the two, you'll find that there is an enormous difference. Most of this just lists his works and the things that he had done, and doesn't really try to integrate him very greatly in his profession or in his time. The architect of the Dictionary of National Biography and its first editor was this man, Leslie Stephen, who also happened to be the father of Virginia Woolf. Stephen had been approached by the publisher George Smith to put together a volume that was very similar to the kind of things that had been produced in places like Germany and France. The idea was to produce some sort of document of the figures that had shaped the nation. Stephen and his successor, Sidney Lee, worked tirelessly to find contributors who would write the lives of the people that were to be included in the work. It was a massive venture, the first volume coming out in 1885, subsequent volumes following over the next decade and a half. You can see the complete form as it stood with its supplements, all 72 volumes of it, an extraordinary and monumental work. Here we see another one of my biographical subjects, Herbert Mayo. I've done a lot of research on this guy. I probably know as much about him as anybody in the world has ever known about him, apart from the people that actually knew him in the first place. Consequently, I was particularly intrigued by his entry into the first Dictionary of National Biography. Here we see the full-text version of Herbert Mayo's original entry in the Dictionary of National Biography. It does all the usual stuffs of outlining his claims to recognition, his claims to fame, but it's also peculiarly reticent and borders upon the critical, which was extremely rare for these kind of entries. We see, for example, in this paragraph, something that he did being described as ill-judged. So there's a very defensive quality to this particular entry. It's only when we start looking at what was lying underneath it that we realise that there are some really quite extraordinary things going on. Firstly, the Dr. Druitt, who's quoted here, was actually a close relation of Herbert Mayo and had been a pupil under him, so he was providing first-hand testimony of Mayo's life. Nowhere can we see that in the entry itself. And then if we have a look down at the bottom-hand corner here, the bottom right-hand corner, we see these initials, CHM. Now that was the person that wrote the entry, Charles Herbert Mayo. Charles Herbert Mayo, a member of the family, has personal knowledge. He would, for example, have known that Jessica Matilda Arnold separated from Mayo and went to live with another man. Quite a scandalous thing for those particular times. So in looking at this entry that has all the hallmarks of objectivity, What we've actually got is a very personal and subjective account. Now, when we bear in mind that the Dictionary of National Biography has often been portrayed as a definitive dictionary of biography, the facts in here are supposed to be ingrained in granite. When we see an entry like Mayo's and start taking it apart, we can see some of the problems that exist with biography, and particularly with this official document. This strange fascination that we all have with other people and what it means to be a human is something that seems to have impelled the biographical spirit. Biography has been around as a means of describing people's lives for thousands of years, since classical times. And this is where we start this part of our story. One of the greatest names in biography is that of the Greek historian Plutarch, who lived 46 AD to 120 AD. He was Greek, but he became a Roman citizen. And he was most famous for a number of works that he wrote on the lives of the great men of the classical era, men like Alexander the Great and the Roman emperors. I think we can get a flavour of the way that Plutarch thought about his craft, about the way that he wrote biography, from this particular quote. "It is not histories I am writing, but lives, and in most glorious deeds there is not always an indication of virtue or vice. Indeed, a small thing like a phrase or a jest often makes a greater revelation of a character than battles where thousands die." For Plutarch, biography had a specific purpose, and that purpose was to illustrate virtue and vice, to provide lessons that people could learn from the lives of the great and the good, and the great and not so good. After the collapse of the Roman Empire, biography lapsed into hagiography, the description of the lives of saints that was specifically geared towards demonstrating their holiness, their sanctity, their proximity to God, their difference from other normal, more corrupt human beings. We often think of Shakespeare as the greatest of playwrights, the creator of immortal characters, a fictionalist supreme who's able to touch upon the very core of human nature. But he was also, to some degree, a biographer, as we can see in this clip from the beginning of his play, Richard III.
Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this son of York. And all the clouds that lowered upon our house in the deep bosom of the ocean buried. Now are our brows bound with victorious wreaths. Our bruised arms hung up for monuments. Our stern alarms changed to merry meetings. Our dreadful marches to delightful measures.
The play was a very sophisticated piece of propaganda. Its biographical portrayal of Richard III as a deformed, ruthless king, designed to vindicate the regime of Henry VII that had toppled Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, thus bringing to an end the York dynasty. The victor, Henry Tudor, or Henry VII, ruthlessly executed his power and took a firm control of the Kingdom of England. Shakespeare, writing in the time of Elizabeth I, wanted to demonstrate that her forebears had righteously grasped power and that her throne was legitimately held. Biography was therefore being used for specifically political ends. But most often, biography was simply used to teach moral lessons, good lessons, and usually nothing but good was said of the dead. That is, until this man, Dr. Samuel Johnson, came along and changed the very nature of biographical practice. Johnson was determined to provide an unerring portrait of the peoples whose lives he described, to show the beautiful and the base in his subjects' lives, to portray both vice and virtue. And this was very much the approach that was taken by James Boswell, the companion of Samuel Johnson and his first biographer. In the life of Samuel Johnson, Boswell portrays Johnson with warts and all, as a great man, but a great man with some flaws and some vices. It was certainly a new way of writing biography. But the openness of Johnson and Boswell was soon to become closed down again under the forces of Victorianism. Biography once again seemed to be an art dedicated to illustrating moral virtue and moral virtue alone. This was perhaps best characterized by the work of Thomas Carlyle, seen here as a young man. Carlyle was particularly concerned to demonstrate how the spirit of the age could be summoned up in the character of an individual, how history was shaped by the lives of great men. As he said grandiloquently, "We have undertaken to discourse here for a little on great men, their manner of appearance in our world's business, how they've shaped themselves in the world's history, what ideas men formed of them, what work they did, on heroes namely, and on their reception and performance, what I call hero worship and the heroic in human affairs." Too evidently this is a large topic deserving quite other treatment than we can expect to give it at present. A large topic, indeed, an illimitable one, wide as universal history itself. For as I take it, universal history, the history of what man has accomplished in this world, is at bottom the history of the great men who have worked here. For Carlyle, biography seemed to be the essence of history itself. Carlyle was barely dead when General Gordon besieged in Khartoum for a year from 1884 to 1885, holding out against the forces of the Muslim leader Muhammad Ahmed. This was all part of British attempts to extend their power and influence throughout Africa. Gordon, the quintessential Victorian, an evangelical Christian believer, became one of the great heroes of empire, a figure who seemed to encapsulate all that Carlyle had talked about in his heroes, one of the ultimate Victorians. Lytton Strachey, a bohemian and one of the founders of the Bloomsbury Group, had no time for Victorianism. He had no time for the cant of morality that was at the heart of the Victorian project, and he sought to puncture the pretensions and the hypocrisy of Victorianism. His principal weapon was to be biography, and in his work, Eminent Victorians, he chose 4 targets who seemed to him to represent all that was worst about the Victorian era. His scalpel dissected the famous celebrated nurse Florence Nightingale. He excoriated Cardinal Manning, who had been responsible for the split from the Church of England and going over to the Roman Catholic Church. He paid particular attention to the vile regime of Thomas Arnold, the famous headmaster of Rugby School. But of all of the heroes that Strachey took apart, none was taken apart with more vigour, force or viciousness than General Gordon. On the eventual defeat of the Mahdi some 13 years later, a memorial service was held to celebrate the deeds of General Gordon and to see him as the architect of the victory that had just been achieved. As Strachey describes it, the service was conducted by 4 chaplains of the Catholic, Anglican, Presbyterian and Methodist persuasions and concluded with a performance of Abide With Me, the General's favourite hymn, by a select company of Sudanese buglers. Everyone agreed that General Gordon had been avenged at last. Who could doubt it? General Gordon himself possibly fluttering in some remote nirvana. The pages of a phantasmal Bible might have ventured on a satirical remark. But General Gordon had always been a contradictious person, even a little off his head perhaps, though a hero. And besides, he was no longer there to contradict. At any rate, it had all ended very happily in a glorious slaughter of 20,000 Arabs, a vast addition to the British Empire, and a step in the peerage for Sir Evelyn Baring.
It's arguable whether today biography has moved any further forward from where Strachey took it to. You can read the works of people like Peter Ackroyd that have a very postmodern twist to them, but they're essentially doing a very, very similar thing to what Strachey was. In particular, attempting to illustrate the tenor of a time through the individual that is being examined, while also trying to explore the forces that shaped that individual. In the next module, what I want to look at is the way that scientific biography has worked within the framework that I've just mapped out.